Hello. What were you gonna say?
I was just saying, can you see the knife behind my head?
Knife?
It makes you look really cool. I can't actually. Oh, like
No.
is it the thing that has the yellow on the handle?
Yeah,
No.
I'm gonna
Can we see
block it
that?
out.
Oh.
I thought it was a book.
Okay. So film versus digital is something that's kind of interesting, and my opinion on it has sort of evolved over the years. In terms of audience perception, I think that it is to the point where you can convincingly fool an audience that if you were wanting to shoot on film and you shot on digital, you can do the post work that would convince an audience that it was shot on film. I think a general audience wouldn't be able to notice the difference, especially considering there are a lot of movies that are shot on film that look like they were digital. Quiet Place being one of the prime examples where they did like a lot of noise remover and things like that, grain removal. And it's color graded to sort of look like a digital aesthetic. So I think in terms of like final product, I don't really think it matters at all. I think that it is at this point not such a big deal. However, I believe that a director should be able to, and DP should be able to use the tools that they want to create something. Regardless of the effect that comes at the end, I think that the way that you make a movie is important. And I think that if you were to use film, even if it's like a bullshit reason, like I just think it looks magical or something like that, I still think that as a director you should be able to make that decision. Again, like you could look at it from an angle too of digital art. You can convincingly create digital art that looks like it's been hand painted, very convincingly. Like you could look at it and go, that could be hand painted. But there's a difference in the way it's made, and I think that often can factor in. But in terms of does it matter to the final quality of the film, I don't think so. And
Yeah, do you mind if I go next?
yeah, you're actually right on now.
Fantastic, because I'm kind of like Cullen. I sincerely can't argue as to which one is superior, because I don't, because like Cullen said, I think you can fool people enough that the point is kind of superfluous. However, I do think that there's something interesting about people's relationship and understandings of both. I think there's kind of a mystique that comes with celluloid. Like I think the idea of film being a tangible thing as opposed to digital, which is usually like data stored on a hard drive, people have a kind of visceral attachment to, say, like holding a canister and saying like, this is mine, this is my baby. And I mean, there's all those great stories about like Elaine May and George Lucas, like, stealing back their prints from studios so they could be like, no, you're not going to touch this. You're not going to cut this. I want this in its intended form. And I could see why why there's sort of a mythology that almost goes with like film and like how sensitive it is. But I do think that digital film has paved the way for basically filmmakers the world over to participate in a way that otherwise they wouldn't have been able to. There's this really fantastic, not an interview, but it's like an excerpt from a documentary. I think it's about the making of 10 by Abbas Kiarostami, but I don't know if that's what it's from. But basically, he elaborates on why he loves using a digital camera. And to him, he says, you get a degree of authenticity from people because they're not intimidated by the size of something that, like, it's not nearly as imposing to shoot people on, say, a tiny digital camcorder as opposed to like a 35 millimeter camera. And he talks about shooting documentaries and fiction films alike and getting more authentic responses from people just because of that camera size.
I think the idea for me is there's one key difference, or there's a number of differences, but in my experience, the one key difference is there's a certain amount of technique and discipline that comes with shooting for film, because it's seen as this idea of like, well, once it's on the film, it's on the film. It's not like a card where you can delete it and do it again. And in some ways, in my experience, I have done a push to shoot a short on film, and I'm currently pushing to shoot a short on film so that I can then push back with the producers so that I can get more rehearsal time. Because for me, with the movement into digital, there's been this really strange movement of, oh, you know what? It's all on digital. We don't need to rehearse. We don't need to do anything, that sort of thing. We just load the camera and we shoot, which I think is actually a very counterproductive way to shoot. You always need to rehearse, no matter what format you're shooting on. And with also another thing that's come with the change in format has been tighter deadlines. It's low budget indies it's like 100% you got to get it done in 19 days. It's like, well, why? Like, what's changed? And a lot of it is pointed to the fact of like, well, it's a digital format now, but that shouldn't matter. The discipline of filming in the format you're filming on has changed. Yes, that's true, but it hasn't gotten that much easier. So I think there is one big difference, is that there is still a respect for the discipline that is needed to shoot in film, because it's like, you screw up that canister, well, that's gone, sort of thing. But again, that being said, it's not the same thing. I've worked in dailies, and you lose a card, sort of thing. But there is still this mental state where it's like, there's a discipline needed for film, and I'm okay with that. I'm okay working into that.
I don't think it matters at all. And almost counter. It's interesting because I've never heard the argument that like Blair just brought up, which I think has some like validity as far as it being seen as different or easier, or even just having like the attitudes around like what we're shooting is more sacred if it's on film and it feels more permanent. But I like digital for the fact that you can sort of turn on a camera and there's less like pressure and worry around everything going perfectly and everything having to come out a certain way, and not having that kind of breathing room. I think particularly for performers, I think digital allows for a lot more like improvisation and playing with a scene. I think it allows for a lot more letting sort of like actors run with something, when you normally in a film, when you are on like, when and it was also just, it was really expensive. It's a lot more expensive to be like doing a lot of that stuff and having to worry about what's on the actual film. I almost respect it more in the way of like, if you were an editor and you used to physically cut film, I could almost imagine like the like tradition of that going away would almost be different, because it's so much different to digitally edit something. But I think from a standpoint of shooting, you just are given a lot more freedom when you have a digital format, especially because we've been able to essentially match the film aesthetic, which was like a big part of it for a while, was they really looked different. There's very little parts of that like draw me in any kind of way at this point, just because all I see it is like restricting, not like allowing for anything more.
I think one thing that's really interesting is that we all basically touched on completely different aspects. Like Michael, you sort of went almost into like, not necessarily documentary, but the reason that it could be really useful to shoot documentary on digital with tinier cameras and things like that. I talked about where it's very specifically, from a visual standpoint, I think that film looks a lot better than like a typically digital looking image. But as you said, Mandy, we've gotten to the point where you can successfully trick an audience into thinking that a digital image is film. And then Blair, yours, it's interesting that we all just sort of touched on different aspects of production. I do kind of speak in line with Blair as well. I think that it's not a coincidence that you've seen the accuracy and the technique of someone like a focus puller or a grip, like especially like dolly grips and things like that are physically moving the camera. The technique there has really, not to say that it's gone down, because I think there are a lot of talented people that are still working these days. But like if you were on a set in the 40s, it was like you had the millimeter down to where you were. The focus puller didn't have a viewfinder. They had to just know, which, I mean, any good focus puller should these days know without looking at a monitor, the distance. But there was something, like you said, Blair, about like it's almost two sides of the same sword of like, on one hand, if you're the director that likes the freedom, like you said, Mandy, that's totally a reason to go digital. Whereas if you're a director who's like, I want everyone on their best game while the camera's rolling, and I want them to understand that like this take is sacred. We have 2 minutes of time to get this correct, or else it's going to cost us another, $300.
I think something that also is not often spoken about, maybe it comes from a place that people just don't know, is the fact that like the digital format or workflow hasn't actually made things less complicated for a lot of times. Again, working in dailies, I've worked on feature films in which we've had problems down the line in the workflow because people just weren't aware of the limitations of a camera's like piece. It's like, oh, we're going to just do a huge blow up. I'm like, well, that's great on that former footage, the one that you're shooting not at slow-mo, but this camera goes from 4K to 2.1 when you go to a certain frame rate, sort of thing, and there's not that consideration there, and there is a certain sort of level of like, oh, you know what, like we'll just film it and then it comes off the card and it goes somewhere else, but that's not really the case either. There's a lot of treatments that goes like to create the clips for editors and like and save the data and that sort of thing. That's not quite it feels like everyone's like, oh, it's less steps to use a digital format, which isn't true. It's just less physical. Like we're not actually taking it to a place to get it developed. It's just there's a lot of steps in the digital workflow.
In fact, you could even argue that the film workflow was simpler. That from start to
in some ways, yes.
It was,
yeah, in many ways, yes.
And maybe this is just like, even like I've maybe just worked with some directors who just have ego, but I've had enough, I've worked with enough sort of people who are so, like, not all directors are great leaders or like encouragers, like, and I don't necessarily agree with like having sort of like an iron fist kind of set, and I can't imagine with you if you had the worry of something like if you fuck this up, it's going to cost us $300 because it's going to cost us that much more because you're literally wasting the film. Like I can't imagine that those sets were more fun to work on, or were like sets even today working on digital are stressful enough and there's enough going on and there's still shit, but I like when working with some of the people that I've worked with, like I can't imagine if you had something where people make mistakes, humans make errors, and like human error is a very natural thing, and I think there was this almost like elitist viewpoint in film where like you would hire a focus puller and it was like do or die on the day. You either got it or you don't. You either start your career that day or you gotta change and start everything over again, and there was no room for like messing up and getting back on the saddle, and everything was a lot more, and it kind of felt like a way of keeping film in this sort of like elitist box where you had to be like welcomed into the club, whereas like digital just as a format also opened it up to a bunch of people are able to buy digital cameras because it's more accessible, like as a thing that we can just go and you can learn how to edit from your house, and there's free editing softwares, and like it's like the gift of film has been like spread, and I could see like a lot of people in the old school film community like, no, but what happened to our like hard work and yelling at people on set when they mess something up, and then spending hours trying to develop film and physically cut things together when you had the technology to make those steps easier.
Do you think there are types of egos or personalities that are particularly drawn to, like, say, film or digital?
I think that there's a traditionalist element for sure. There's like my look at film versus digital is completely case by case. It's a matter of choice of medium. Like that's what the way I think of it is it's like choosing canvas versus, or like the type of paint that you're using. And some things work better for different things. Like, again, I mentioned this before, but documentary, I would not want to shoot a documentary on film these days. Whereas I think that the attraction to film often does come down. Like there are very many people who don't think of it that way though, or don't think of it like you or Blair, or Mandy, we were talking about it, like they think of it simply as a means of aesthetic, or simply as a means of just like, I'm making a real movie because I'm shooting on film and not going beyond, okay, what are the resources we have? Somebody will blow their entire movie's budget on 16 millimeter film and then leave nothing for actors or nothing for catering or nothing for sound.
My major hang-ups about this film versus digital argument is the fact that we're treating them as if like the disciplines should be different, but they shouldn't. We should still have the same level of discipline based on both format. And frankly, we should have I know a lot of people who have less understanding in the digital workflow than they do in the actual film workflow, and yet they're still like, oh, we're using a digital format. It's like, well, you have to know what you're talking about here. You have to know your limitations, and you should know what's going to work and what's not going to work.
You know, I think it was Deakins who said something like he shoots them identically. Like he doesn't light any different for digital than he does for film. He doesn't treat the set any different because it's a discipline that I think, you know, was created in the industry for shooting on film that does hold over in the digital world really well, in terms of just sticking to a schedule and getting things done on time and things like that.